Scribbles, it's Ibble. I'm gonna be trying to do a voiceover for this video, which is something I've talked about doing in the past, but I've never been successful with it. Every time I sit down to try, I end up getting frustrated because I really struggle to be concise with my words, and I always end up running out of time. But you've probably already noticed that this video is an hour long, so I'm gonna try my best to actually do a voiceover for the speed paint because I really don't want to find an hour's worth of music. Like usually I try to pick themed music, or I use music from like the playlist that I have centered around the main character of the illustration. But for this one, I just don't want to deal with the copyright and everything. And I figured it would be a little bit more interesting if I talked about the piece throughout the hour. That being said, feel free to put on your own music and mute this video, or play it in the background, or I don't know, skip to the end and see the final piece if you don't care about the speed paint. Like, I don't know. I really make these videos for myself mostly, so that I can kind of look back and see my process and my progress as an artist. But yeah, I think it would be fun to do a voiceover video. So that's what we're gonna try today. Heads up, it is going to be quite rambly, I think, because I did not script this. You could probably tell. I did not script this, and I don't really know what I want to talk about. I just wanted to kind of, explain the piece a little bit and have a little chat. So let's get into that. The illustration that you're watching me create right now is a piece that I did for a zine centered around Kaede Akamatsu from Danganronpa, V3 Killing Harmony. The zine's title is Unfinished Harmony, and I applied to be the cover artist and was accepted, so this illustration is the cover art for the zine, which is pretty cool. I've never been the cover artist for a zine before. I'm usually like a page artist or a merch artist, so this is a really fun experience getting to design a spread for the cover. I believe this piece took me 60 hours, and the speed paint is sped up like 50 times, I think. I wanted to talk a little bit about the concept for this piece before talking about any of like the technical parts or like the issues that I had or anything like that. The head mod slash organizer of the zine, he gave me like a thumb at the very beginning, I think. It's been a while. Since I think I finished this piece in October, and I started working on it sometime early last year, so it's been a while, but I think he gave me a thumb of kind of his idea. It was a very rough thumb of what he wanted for the cover. And then I kind of pitched some ideas based off of that, / based off of like my own interpretations. But in his thumb, he had Kaede playing the piano with the full cast standing behind her. And I kind of used that composition as a reference, moved the angle to be more of like not exactly an extreme worm's eye angle, but more from below to just kind of enhance like the drama of the scene or whatever. I remember the mod team wanted a very peaceful and serene feeling to the cover to kind of encapsulate like Kaede's relationship with the rest of the cast. So that was the concept that I went with, and my priorities in terms of composition were that I wanted Kaede to be the main focus of the entire piece, and I also wanted her to take up the full front cover of the zine, since the zine is centered around her as a character, but that means everyone else got shunted to the back cover, of course. But the additional challenge on top of that was that from the beginning I had plans to turn this piece into a print illustration for my shop as well. So the composition couldn't just be two separate compositions. They had to work both as individual pieces for the front and back cover, but also flow together harmoniously, while also not putting any important details in the middle of the piece, which is very difficult. Obviously, you can't have important details or faces or anything like that in the middle of a cover piece or a spread for a zine, because that is where the spine goes. So anything there will be kind of lost to the spine, the curvature of the book. My solution to that, and you'll see this more when I work on the background elements later in the speed paint, but my solution was to have the flow of the piece, overall flow from Kaede across to the other page. And then I used Kaito, who's you'll see will be in the background in the distance. I used his coat to kind of break up the middle of the piece so that it didn't feel as much like there was just a straight line down the middle. But then also to help with the inevitability of the separation, the feeling of separation between the two sides, I decided to have the characters be back to back and specifically have Kaede and Shuichi. Oh, I should probably, spoiler alert for DRV3, Danganronpa V3 Killing Harmony. If you haven't played the game and you care about spoilers for it, don't watch this. Go away. Click off the video right now. But anyway, I wanted to juxtapose Shuichi and Kaede as the main protagonists of the game, as well as have the rest of the characters kind of walking away from her. And I think that helps a lot with making the composition feel very natural, even though it's split in two. And then thematically as well, I wanted to make sure that no one else's face was properly showing, or specifically their eyes. You know, it's in some places, like for Kaito and Rantaro, it couldn't be helped that their faces had to show somewhat, but for the most part, I tried to keep everyone else's faces obscured to only highlight Kaede and Shuichi's faces, and specifically their expressions. And I have Shuichi being the only one looking back at Kaede, and everyone else is kind of moving forward, kind of as like symbolic representation of what goes down in chapter 1 of the game, or something like that. Anyway, I thought it was like a cool composition. I think one of the things the mods mentioned to me when we were discussing what to do for the cover was that they wanted me to include as many of the other characters as possible, because while this is obviously a zine about Kaede, it's also about how she interacts with the rest of the cast. Unfortunately, with the composition that I had in mind, I really didn't feel confident in my ability to include every single other character from the, like, what is it? It says total cast of 16 or something like that. But I did try to include some of the main characters that she interacts with or has like special free time events with and everything, slash just characters that I like. It definitely is a little bit biased. I mean, Kaede, Rantaro, Shuichi, and Kokichi are my top 4 characters from V3, so, you know, I jump at any chance to be able to draw them. But yeah, I ended up settling on this kind of idea of them all walking away, and I tried to make the characters fade a little bit into the distance as they got further from the camera, so it's kind of implied like, oh, there are other characters back there too. I promise, you just can't see them right now, but they're there, I swear. Yeah, just to kind of compensate for the fact that I couldn't include every character. Speaking of Rantaro, you can really see me struggling with his, well, both his face and his pants here. I think even when I end up painting over, because you'll see how my process goes, or maybe if you watch my other speed paints, you're probably already familiar with my process, but I tend to do lines, flats, then I shade, and then I go over and render on top of everything, like a paint over. But for some reason I was really struggling with making his pose look natural. It was just such an awkward angle, specifically with the arms, the arm placement. Whenever I draw Rantaro, one of my goals is to make him look as pretty and attractive as possible, because that was one of my first impressions of his character when I first played the game. This was really difficult at this angle. I also was really intent on having his side profile show, just because I really wanted to have, well, he has hair that makes it easy to hide his eyes even at a side profile. I wanted him to have this mysterious and like cool look to him. I don't know. I'm getting kind of embarrassed talking about it. Can you tell how much I like Rantaro as a character? But anyway, yeah, I really struggled. Like, there's only so many ways that you can okay, that's not true. I was gonna say there's only so many ways that you can make a character, like different characters walk differently, but that's so not true, because like in animation, you know, characters have like different walk cycles and whatnot. I'm just not as familiar with that. So I was trying to characterize him by his walk, but at this angle that you can see the crossing of the legs, the way that I wanted him to be holding his neck still, to look like cool and mysterious. It was all really conflicting with one another. And then on top of that, even if I was able to get the legs to look nice, I was really struggling with the folds of his pants at this angle. I'm not sure why, because baggier clothes I usually don't struggle as much with. And you can see I drew his pants from behind, like looking just fine. And I don't know what kind of pants he's supposed to be wearing. I settled on trying to make them kind of like cargo-y, but I just could not for the life of me make them look natural in this pose. It just looked really weird. I think I did eventually figure something out, and then later like I said, I painted over it, but you can really see me struggling here. Honestly, I think one of the reasons I struggled so much was because his placement on the canvas, or in comparison to the rest of the characters, he gets cut off like at a kind of awkward place, honestly. With cargo pants, I like to like draw the ends being like wider and like kind of like flared out with like a what do you call it? A cuff, as you can see in the little sketch that I did off to the side to try and like help myself, but I wasn't able to get that across with where he's cut off. Like, if you were to isolate him and say that was the piece, I would not choose to cut him off there because it's a very awkward point to cut his body off, as it creates a kind of weird tangent with the edge of the canvas. But given that he's in the background and a lot of him is going to be covered up, it wasn't really something that I could help with this piece. Oh, I did have a lot of help from my best friend, Sayakyun. They really helped me with the posing and everything for this because I had this idea of it being kind of like from a below angle, which is not really my forte when it comes to perspective, but I kind of roughed out like where I wanted the characters to be in a thumbnail, and then they overlaid 3D models in Clip Studio Paint, and that was extremely helpful as a reference for, you know, where the characters should go, you know, how big they should be, like just everything. I don't think I could have done it without their help, so I'm really grateful for that. I do remember when they were placing the models, they mentioned that they placed the models for Kaede and Shuichi, and they said I had somehow gotten the depth in the rough thumb like exactly right, like where they placed the models on the grid was exactly where my rough sketches for them were. So that's kind of like I kind of stroked my ego a little bit. I was like, maybe I do know a little bit about perspective after all. Yeah, no, but I do think it's a really good tool to use, 3D models that is, if you know how to use them effectively. Even tracing over 3D models I don't think is necessarily bad. I try to avoid it when possible because I often don't like the way that 3D models, like the proportions are stylized compared to how I like to stylize my characters. But I do think as long as you're aware of how the stylization of a 3D model might skew your style, and you kind of take measures to combat that, as well as try to use them with an active knowledge, I guess, of anatomy from the get-go, and using them really as a tool and not as a crutch, then I think they can be really helpful in both speeding up the process and as a point of reference for whatever composition you're trying to achieve. In general, I tend to use a lot of references to create my drawings, and this piece was definitely no exception. My reference board was crazy, which, by the way, I accidentally recorded my screen wrong at the beginning of this video, so if you notice that square with a bunch of like references on it, it's a program called PicRefs. I don't know, I'll put it on the screen just in case you're wondering. I do use a lot of references, kind of both as like a mood board and a reference. I know some people think that using references is like cheating in your art, which I've never understood that. That makes absolutely no sense to me. References are just another tool that you can use in your art, and again, you kind of have to learn how to use them properly. I think a lot of people view using reference as just copying one-to-one what you see, and while I do think that life drawing as a skill is somewhat useful while using reference, and sometimes you do need to kind of copy one-to-one, obviously not other people's art, but you know, maybe an object or something that you're trying to draw, In most cases, if you're utilizing reference as a tool for an illustration, you're not going to want to copy it one-to-one. Of course, if you're doing a study or something, that's different, but it's really about taking a bunch of different references and mashing them all together to create something new, because more often than not, what you actually want to draw is not going to be exactly what the reference looks like. And so that's where having multiple references comes in handy, which is kind of what I did for the piano here. I had so many references of pianos pulled up. I researched a lot about what the interior of a grand piano looked like because for some reason I decided to make this piano glass. I really didn't need to do that. I don't know why I did that. Well, I do know. I thought it would be more interesting. I thought since I was doing the underside of the piano, like I didn't want it to just be plain like black or like one color, which I'm sure I could have made that look nice too with the rendering, but I just like really had the urge to make it glass because I felt like it also added to the like otherworldly, the serene feel of the piece overall. And I also kind of wanted you to be able to see Kaede's hands through the piano. I didn't want to cover it up because I don't know, it felt weird to do that. So that is why I am drawing all of the inside parts of the piano and all of this overlapping mess. It kind of looks messy when it's just the line art, but I end up going over that with the colors and stuff later. But yes, I did a lot of research into the pianos. I looked up a lot of references. I found a 3D model of a glass piano. Unfortunately, it wasn't like accurate to life, so I still had to kind of guess what the inside of a piano looked like based on like references and how it worked and everything, and it was a lot. It was a lot, but I am pretty happy with how it turned out overall. I do think I had to make some adjustments to the actual, what would you call it, anatomy or blueprint of the piano, of like how a grand piano actually works and functions, just to make it work with the position that I'd already drawn Kaede in, because I was not gonna redraw her. Yeah, I did end up drawing all of the innards of the piano and then covering them up anyway with flowers, which was partially to kind of disguise the fact that I still, even after drawing all that, I still didn't really understand what was going on properly inside. But also during the planning stages, the mods had mentioned that they wanted reference to the little flower fragments that you gain as like friendship points or whatever when you make friends with the characters in the game as Kaede. And so for that, I wanted to go with like cherry blossoms because I think the shape of the flowers in the game are like sakura petals. So I wanted to take that a little bit further and add some flowers coming out of her piano and hanging off of it because I thought that was really pretty and added to the overall ambience of the piece. I ended up going with white wisteria, I believe, and one of my friends suggested that I do, what are they called? Oh my gosh. Bleeding hearts. That's what they're called, bleeding hearts. My friend gave me the suggestion because I was like, oh, what kind of flowers should I put other than the wisteria to like kind of like break up the wisteria, which I think bleeding hearts represent like heartbreak and sadness. So I thought it was like fitting for the kind of like bittersweet, melancholy-esque feel that this piece is meant to have. As I'm laying down the base colors, you might notice that I put like a weird like yellow gradient on Kaede's hair. It was kind of just a visual note for myself to remember how I wanted to shade her hair and for the lighting. I was really excited to get to the lighting in her hair because I had this very strong vision from the start of her being backlit and the lighting kind of glowing through that like portion of her hair that is like the brightest yellow right now. I knew I wanted the other characters to be kind of facing the light and walking into it, while Kaede was the only one facing away from it, and her face is kind of overshadowed, or that was the plan. So while doing the base colors, I kind of tried to reflect that. Recently, I've been trying to plan out the lighting for my pieces more intentionally. I think for a long time when I was first, starting to do more illustrations, I kind of just winged the lighting and did like the same type of lighting for every piece, which I think worked for me at the time and still kind of does depending on the piece, but the lighting was extremely important for this piece. I knew I wanted it to be dramatic, but I didn't want it to be too dark. That is something that I tend to struggle with in my artwork sometimes because I am focusing so much on the contrast of the colors and making the colors really deep and saturated. My pieces do end up darker or more jewel toned. But with that in mind, I wanted to keep this piece very light and airy and soft. So that was something I was definitely thinking about when I was laying down the base colors. I was basically like using local color and then adjusting it to kind of be softer depending on where I thought the lighting might be hitting, if that makes sense. Like for instance, I tried to dim down the colors of the background characters a bit, and you can see that I'm putting down a couple gradients here and there just to kind of indicate like where I want the tones to be darker. Something I strive for when I'm doing my rendering work and my shading is trying to shade and incorporate the lighting into my shading, if that makes sense, rather than thinking of those as separate elements. I do think it can be really helpful to separate out lighting and then further shading as like different steps. But my point is that I try not to become overly reliant on multiply layers or overlay layers. Those are definitely tools that I use in my artwork, but I try to keep them as final adjustments for colors and intensifying shades if I need to towards the end. And so what I mean by that is I try to be very intentional with the lighting from the get-go and paint mostly within the local color rather than using a multiplied layer over top, just because I find that it gives me more control over the colors that I am able to use, which is something I'm very particular about. And also I find that it helps me learn and understand lighting and color theory much better than if I am to, from the get-go, put down a multiply layer. Sometimes I still will use multiply layers in that way if I feel like really, lazy is not the right word because I think it is just a different process. But if I don't feel like putting down all the base colors and I just want to skip to the rendering, then I will use a multiply layer as an overall base for the shading and then just render on top and kind of adjust the colors that way. And that does still seem to have a similar effect. So honestly, I don't really need to do the shading the way that I'm doing it here. And I think you'll see for the background characters, I do end up using the multiply layers to kind of speed up the process. But since kaede was the focus, kaede and shuichi both are the focus of this piece, I wanted to make sure that I had full control over the lighting and the colors that I was using. When I'm painting something that's mostly in shadow, I find that I prefer to block in the lighting rather than the shadows. It's just easier for me to think about for some reason, which is kind of the opposite way that I usually, like if I'm doing something that's in very neutral light, I will, start with base colors and then block in the shadows, and kind of shape the light out of that. But you can see kind of the way that I did the skin and the way that I did the hair is I kind of put a darker color for the shadow and then blocked in where I thought the light would be hitting the most. Something I'm always trying to stay cognizant of during my shading process, and something that I'm still definitely working on, is remembering to block in the bigger shapes of light. I don't find this initially hard to do. I really enjoy, for the most part, doing the big blocks, but I do tend to lose that initial shape, I think, sometimes when I'm shading. And I think it's really important to preserve whatever initial shape of shadow that you're blocking in order to get across whatever lighting effect you want. I really enjoy detail work and incorporating smaller shades and different colors into my bigger shadows. That's something I really like about my style, but I do think it's important to not lose that bigger shape. So wow, look at how, I love when I add the colored line art and suddenly everything meshes together. It's so satisfying. It's the point where I'm able to see my vision more clearly, and then I'm able to start rendering over top and blending together everything even more. I do think there's an appeal to doing darker and harsher line art even over a rendered style as well, and it's something that I've been trying to experiment with other pieces, but for this one specifically, I wanted everything to be pastel and soft like I mentioned, so I am really happy with how the rendering turned out on kaede. kaede. I just think it turned out really pretty. I'm especially proud of her sleeve, the way that I did the highlights on her sleeve, and the little chunks of light peeking through the rest of the cast shadows from her backpack and her arms on her vest. And then of course you can see me doing the hair here, and I had so much fun making the hair look very silky and soft. Something I did in the paint over here as well is just strengthening the lighting, especially on her skirt. I think it was a little too gradient. There wasn't enough of a hard, there we go. There wasn't enough of a hard line between the light and the shading. So I fixed that up a little bit. I remember at one point while working on this, I had a drawing session that was 8 hours straight of just rendering kaede, which sounds a little bit insane. I think the actual recording ended up being 6 or 7 hours when you factor in like breaks and whatnot. I think I took like a few breaks to like respond to messages and get up and drink water. Not to eat. I did not eat throughout that whole time. I just remember checking the clock when I sat down to start working and then checking it again when I stopped and realizing, oh, it's been 8 hours and I am starving. Yeah, I sometimes get into that flow state, especially when I'm doing the rendering. I think rendering work is... I enjoy all aspects of art. It's hard for me to pick a favorite part, but I think rendering is definitely the part of the process where I'm able to get into a flow state most often. I was really satisfied with how the rendering on her legs turned out as well, specifically the underside of her knee and then that really saturated highlight on her sock, as well as the cooler tones that I used to kind of push back the other leg. I really like doing that whenever I can fit it in my art, kind of using tones and value to push back parts of the drawing. It's kind of like atmospheric perspective, except exaggerated / stylized, because obviously in real life, atmospheric perspective is only applicable when things are very far away. But I really like using it to push back certain parts of a character to kind of enhance the feeling of depth in an illustration. And then another thing that I think I did particularly well with kaede was utilizing saturation and bright colors in terms of the highlights, and specifically like in her hair, that like bright tone in her hair. I was really intent on making the lightest part stand out to really emphasize the lighting that's like shining down on her. And then I also put some saturated colors in certain areas. I couldn't really explain in words why, like how I choose to put down different values and different tones. It's kind of just from experience and my own like feelings and whims, I guess. But I'm pretty happy with where I chose to put like saturation, and I use cooler tones here. So anything in shadow, I tried to keep shaded very cool toned with blues and purples, and then anywhere where the light hits, I tried to make it feel very warm. So you can see the saturated blues kind of reflecting in her skirt. I really like utilizing bounce light in my art, so that's kind of what you see with the cool highlights on the white of her shirt, and the kind of blues, like lighter values on the folds of her vest and in her hair as well. I kind of just make it up. It really is just a feeling, like I said, but I think it's something that it seems very small, but helps bring the illustration to life, just using that transition. I think it's called the Terminator line in art, but don't quote me on that. I might be using that wrong. But basically the transition between light and shadow, the value that you use to transition between even the harshest part of where the light hits, I think that helps a lot. And then also the subsurface scattering I did in between her like fingers, and like you can see I put like some saturated orange like right in the lightest or the thinnest part of her ear. And I think stuff like that, like small details like that, really like give a more solid effect of like what the lighting is supposed to be and how it's hitting her and how it's interacting with her, if that makes sense. It just makes her feel more solidified within the space and like the environment is interacting with her. Glass is always really fun to shade because I think it's like relatively easy. I kind of just use a blue tint and then go over it with like white reflections / highlights to kind of give the illusion that you know, it's glass. Something I did have to think about was where I wanted it to appear more solid and trying to put shadows on it without making it not look like glass. And so that was a little bit difficult, but I definitely had fun playing around with just adding a bunch of like highlights and like saturated colors. I kind of tried to do, I was looking at pianos and how the reflections work on the lid of the piano, and I noticed that the wires that are connected to all the little hammers inside the piano do tend to like reflect upwards onto the lid of the piano. And so I kind of tried to replicate that a little bit. It's very small. I don't even think you can really see it very well, but I kind of just like played around with that until it looked right. And then I chose to make the underside of the piano the darkest because I figured that's where obviously there's less light hitting there, but then there's also just layers upon layers of glass on the insides of the piano, so I feel like it would catch light less. Oh, but I also added that little refraction of the light through the glass. That's always really fun. I like doing that with transparent pieces in my art. Yeah, there's not really much else to say about this part, which is kind of funny because I've been talking for 30 minutes straight, but I think glass is just really fun and easy and kind of relaxing, honestly, because you can kind of carve out the edges with highlights and then just put down reflections and refractions of light as you see fit, and just kind of make it up and it'll look like glass. So yeah. Oh, I did play around. I did add like an extra shadow on her knee to make it look like it was more underneath the piano. Yay, shibichi time. So you can see me doing the same method that I described with kaede earlier, where I kind of pick the shading color that I want for the main shadow and then almost fill everything up and then block in the lighting out of that, specifically on his skin, and I think I kind of do it on his hair. It's just a little bit easier for me to think about it that way, but I knew from the get-go that I wanted his eyes to be in shadow, like the cast shadow from his hat, but also to kind of make him look a little bit like melancholy and also have his eyes stand out. I wanted them to have like kind of a glowy effect to draw the viewer's eye up to his face and kind of make them a focal point. So I blocked that out initially. I wasn't really happy though with the shadow. You can see me kind of tweaking it, and then later I do end up painting over it. I think I was trying to get the cast shadow of the hat across without making him look too ominous, but I don't think I really got the shape right here at first. But I do tweak it later, and I'm a lot happier with how his face looks in the final product. I also used a multiply layer to go over the entirety of his clothing because his clothing is all the same color and then it's striped. It has a pattern on it, and I kind of have to use a multiply layer when there is a pattern because I don't want to individually shade the pattern. Sometimes I do, depending on what kind of pattern it is, but for pinstripe, it's really not worth it. Actually, for this segment, I think instead of using a multiply layer over the pattern, I made the pattern into an overlay layer to kind of have more control over the colors of the shading. But either way, you know, I'm using some kind of effect layer here to make my life a little bit easier. Since most of his body is in shadow, I tried to emphasize the warm, bright light that's hitting the front of his body, and then I used this cool greenish blue tone to do the highlights on the majority of his clothing and in his hair. I didn't really use any bright highlights in the rest of his hair, unlike kaede. Partially because his hair is already such a dark color, but also because it's almost completely in shadow other than maybe that little front piece that catches the light. So here I'm starting to do the paint over. I just picked a random, whenever I start a paint over, my point of like starting it is kind of random. I just kind of pick a part that I feel like the urge to render and then kind of render out from that a little bit randomly. I like the freedom to be able to kind of just jump around wherever I feel like when I'm doing the paint over, because pretty much all of the paint over is on one layer, and then I use it to correct a bunch of stuff. Unfortunately, here is where I made a major mistake that I did not catch until the head mod of the zine pointed it out to me at the very end. But when I was doing the initial base, not even the base colors, but the way that I fill the characters to color within the lines is I select outside of their lines and then I invert the selection and fill it that way. And unfortunately, while I was doing that, I missed a little section that should not have been filled in his hand. And so right now I shaded his hand, and then like I said before, when I render, I kind of go on autopilot. So even though I was rendering his hand so intently, I somehow did not catch that he has 5 fingers normally, right? He has 4 fingers, 1 thumb, but the inner parts of his fingers, there's 5 of them, even though there's only 4 tips of his fingers. I don't know if you can really see that with the speed paint moving so fast, but anyway, I did end up fixing that at the very end. I had to kind of like commence emergency surgery on him right at the end, which kind of sucked, but you know, I'm glad that the head mod caught that for me and pointed it out, because I would have been really upset to have it go to print like that. This next section is really straightforward. It's just me painting over everything and kind of rendering it more. I think it really exemplifies how much of the work that brings the piece together is actually done during the paint over stage for me. I kind of know when I'm working on a rendered piece that I will be painting over it, so I let myself be a little bit sloppy with the initial putting down of all the shading and everything, and then I let myself carve everything out during the paint over. It just helps to have that initial base, even though it is a little bit of extra work rather than just painting everything on one layer from the beginning. I like that it gives me both some wiggle room for, you know, mistakes and, you know, having a multi-layer system, but also the ability to, like I said, jump around and kind of paint wherever I want. Like I said before, I'm really happy with the adjustments I made during the paint over stage on his face. This is a really difficult angle to make his face work at, but I was very insistent on like having his other eye shown. Like technically I could have just given him a full side profile, but I wanted it to be, I felt like making it slightly 3/4 made the piece feel less flat, like he was actually turning around, but also I did struggle with that a little bit, and I don't think I guess I paint over it later. I come back to it. I think I come back to his face like 10 billion times, honestly, during this piece. Here's what I was talking about earlier with using the background elements to help the flow of the piece move across the canvas. Background elements like these don't really need to be as detailed or be seen as much. They really, just by being there, they kind of like help your eye move, and so I'm putting them like in the middle. I did struggle a little bit with the placement of them and kind of where I wanted them to overlap, because I did want them to feel like they were really in the scene, but I also didn't want them to block out too many important details. I'm kind of putting one over Kaito's hair because I knew that his hair would somewhat show up on the front cover, and I thought it would be kind of weird to just have spiky purple hair without like any reference as to what it was when you're viewing solely the front cover. I think the yellow color that I chose for the pages also helps to break up the pinks and purples and general cooler tones that have been dominating the piece thus far. And later when I do render the clouds and more of the light, I think having the yellow of the pages kind of seamlessly transition into the clouds has a really, really nice effect. You can see that I'm also adding petals in the foreground to just kind of create more depth to the piece and help with the flow as well. In terms of concept though, I also think that having the pages fly off of the sheet music stand that is on Kaede's piano and kind of swirling over, leading the characters away in the direction that they're walking is really nice symbolically of like Kaede leading them through the game even after death. You know, because she was like the leader in the first chapter, she kind of took on that role, and so even with her not being there anymore, she kind of haunts the narrative through being the figure that Shuichi has to follow and that the rest of them are kind of using as a martyr figure almost. And then, of course, with how everything culminates in the last chapter, just everything coming back to that first murder and her trial. I just think that the music sheets are nice. I think they both work compositionally and they hold like a symbolic meaning as well. Anyway, I'm using a multiply layer to kind of block out the main shapes of shadow on all of the characters, and then going in and further using a multiply layer, like I mentioned before, just to save time, to shade and then painting over. I'm basically almost done with Ryoma, so you can see how much quicker it is. It's also a little bit less detailed. I'm trying to intentionally stay a little bit less detailed, which is very difficult for me. That's not a humble brag. I think being able to simplify things is a really important skill to have, and unfortunately that's something I'm still working on. But you know, I'm trying to be a little bit simpler with the shading on these characters as well. Having Ryoma here was really nice because compositionally I was trying to layer the characters in a way that where you could still recognize them from the back, but also, you know, it looked like they weren't just walking in a single file line, that they were like actually layered and like walking away. And Ryoma being so short here was really helpful to that. Kokichi. Of course, I'm gonna have him in a piece that is centered on V3 because, like, how could I not? If you know anything, if you've been following me for a while or know anything about my art, especially in my Danganronpa era, he is my absolute favorite character, probably in the entire series, if not ever. That's a little bit, I usually have a really hard time picking favorites, but I think Kokichi has just been so influential on literally my progress as an artist. That sounds a little bit dramatic, but I think it's entirely true. And probably the main part of my fixation on Danganronpa when it was the main thing that I was drawing back in like the height of my DR era in 2018. Anyway, you can see I just said, oh, I'm trying to be less detailed, and then I went absolutely ham on the clothing folds for some reason, especially considering that not half of these, but like his entire leg I think gets covered up by Himiko anyway. But I really enjoy doing clothing folds, and I've never drawn Kokichi from the back before now, I think, before this piece. So it was really fun to kind of draw his outfit from the back and do those, the little weird stitches that he has in the back and kind of have the skin of his back peeking through tastefully. I really enjoyed that. His outfit is kind of weird as fuck, but you know, it is what it is. I also have this headcanon. This is completely not accurate to his design. I think there's actually a certain way that he like folds his scarf so that it doesn't really have a tie, or the tie is tucked like underneath. But I really like drawing him with a giant bow at the back. So I kind of did that headcanon, and then I also, you can actually, it's so funny because for the most part, I think I tend to stick relatively close to canon designs when I'm drawing these characters. I mean, I have like my own interpretations of style here and there, but with Kokichi, you can really see the bow and then the way that I draw his clothing, where they're like it's more cinched at the waist, his hair being more curly, and even his nails being painted, like, because I headcanon that he paints his nails, of course. I guess I did that for Shuichi too. I headcanon both of them to paint their nails because Shuichi's like a little goth boy, and Kokichi is, you know, I think he canonically likes color and everything, even though his outfit is mostly white. So I like to incorporate it like that, in that way, and I think it looks nice. I wish the speed paint was moving a little bit slower so that you could see the details I added, like in the paint over for Kokichi. Like, I really like the hair peeking through his fingers, but unfortunately we don't have time for that. So Rantaro time, yay! Here you can really see me struggle with the paint over and like kind of try and figure out. I think I end up redoing his entire side profile. I was like happy with it, or like thought it was okay during the lines, and then when I started painting over it, I was like, oh no, I don't like how this looks. And so we start what I call surgery hell, where I just start moving, cutting apart my drawing. It's very destructive. It doesn't really preserve any part of the original drawing, but it's okay because I think it is necessary for me to correct certain parts that I'm just like not happy with. And then of course we'll eventually get to the dreaded paint over. Look at that. I'm redlining his face because I just was not satisfied with it. I was like, he needs to look better. He needs to look more attractive. He needs to have more luscious lips. I definitely think it was worth it for me to paint over and kind of redo it though. I really like how his profile turned out once I did that, and I'm also a really big fan of the way that I shaded his hair here with the pink highlights in the back and the kind of like saturated green underneath where his undercut kind of starts. I also really like the texture that I added. Texture is something that I really like to play around with in my art, and I am trying to incorporate it more. And so especially on the blush on Kaede, Rantaro, and Shuichi, all three of them, I am really proud of how the blush turns out on their cheeks. Like, if you zoom into this piece, make sure to look at the blush because I like it a lot. I do prefer how the pants look since I added some of that atmospheric perspective type jazz that I was talking about earlier. And then you can see me just going over it completely with the paint over and painting in the color. So I went over on a different layer and kind of used an airbrush to airbrush like a faint purple over it. And then I just color picked from that afterwards and painted over the whole thing. I did something similar on Shuichi's leg there, and you can see me adding it right there on Kaito as well. And I'm just attempting to push the characters back more into the background. I really like how it looks on Shuichi's leg, and I like that the little purple highlight I have there. I don't know, I think the complementary colors between the like green gray that his pants are and then the purple is just like really pleasing. Not much to say about Kaito here. He really is kind of not in the spotlight. Sorry, Kaito, but I try to do him justice even though he's in the background. And most importantly, I tried to make his coat flat in the right places. I really like the way I did the sleeve and how it kind of fades to blue and it's just kind of a flat gradient color. I think it works really well with blending into the sky in the background as well. Yay! And then finally moving on to the background, I knew that I wanted it to have a like sunset feel. Obviously, you can probably tell from the colors, and I wanted the clouds to be very pink and like have the sunset kind of fading into like an open blue sky as it got closer to Kaede. I think though I was starting to get a little bit burnt out at this point in the piece, and I was like not super looking forward to doing the background because I don't really enjoy doing backgrounds as much. I think I'm slowly getting better both at like enjoying them and at just doing them, but it's definitely taken a lot of practice and a lot of just like forcing myself to add backgrounds instead of, and think about them more as a bigger part of the piece. And then I'm just adding the light shining through because I had this idea from the beginning of having the golden light rays kind of like beaming down on them. So, and you think it's all over and you don't have to shade any more people, but unfortunately, I did have the intention to block in some characters at the very end, to kind of achieve more of that crowd effect. But it was, like I said, I at this point was very, I wouldn't say like sick of this piece. Throughout the whole thing, it was actually, I didn't run into as many blocks as I thought I would. It was very enjoyable to work on overall, but I was definitely like kind of getting tired of working on all the characters and all of that. So I am blocking in, features of like some characters to kind of fill in the gaps and make it look like there are other people. Not entirely happy with how that turned out, but like it is a very like background part of the piece. And, I do think it at least helps it feel like there's more, that there's not just empty space beyond these characters. You can see me value checking every so often. Also, the closer I get to being done and the more I, render, the more I start struggling with how to make everything balance and coexist without like any one part of the piece taking over. I don't really like shading foliage and I don't have much experience with it, so this was kind of a challenge. But I do think that I ended up doing pretty well with it. Originally, I wanted it to be more detailed and have more depth, but then I realized slowly, like I had intentions to come back to both the tree and the pieces of paper and kind of add more depth to them. But I'm glad that I waited because I realized after rendering everything else that it was much better to keep the background a little bit flatter. It's kind of hard to find that balance between flatness and lack of detail versus like, having it look incomplete. But I do think I was able to balance that out a bit between the background and the foreground. Same thing with these flowers. I'm just painting them in because I wasn't about to hand draw. I do like hand drawing flowers actually, but not this many of them. And I think it was better to have them be painted in and kind of less detailed. I'm adding a glowy effect, both so that I don't have to add as much detail wherever the light is hitting them, but also to have them feel, again, more ethereal and otherworldly. It was around this stage when I sent a whip to one of my friends, and she mentioned specifically that she really liked the way I was able to be more detailed in some places and keep it flatter in other places. So that definitely helped me make the decision to not over render the background. So it's really nice to get other people's opinions, I feel like, especially when you've been staring at a piece for like 60 hours. She also had this really amazing critique/analysis where she mentioned that the sheet music was flowing from the trees and back into the clouds and kind of transitioning, kind of like coming from nature and going back to nature, or like a cycle of birth, life, and then death. And I really, really like that. I think that's one of my favorite analyses I've gotten of this piece so far. And then yay, adding all the Clair de Lune. I just found copyright-free pages of, I think the whole song is copyright-free, but the sheet music of Clair de Lune online, and then took the pages into Clip Studio Paint and used the liquify tool to kind of morph them onto the pages in the drawing. And yeah, we're just about wrapping up. I think this piece ended up being one of my favorite and one of the best pieces I've done to date, and it's kind of special to me because I think of it as like a love letter to Danganronpa V3 as a game and as a series, because, you know, as I mentioned before, Danganronpa has been very formative to my growth as an artist. Before drawing this piece, I had kind of taken a break from Danganronpa art, or I hadn't drawn these characters in a little bit, and so coming back and being able to draw them in an artwork that really shows my growth since getting into the series and since I first drew them, and my improvement as an artist was really nice. And I don't know, I'm just really proud of how this piece came out, and I'm glad that I was able to draw the characters in a way that I feel like does justice to them. So yeah, happy birthday to Kaede Akamatsu, and I'll see you guys next time I have a speed paint to upload. Bye!